we're going to change gears a little bit now. We've been talking about these three forms of work. So we started out early on talking about self-work. And in the book, we talk about a couple different literatures related to that, when self-work being this kind of work that is focused on a self. And so it's self-work defined by the fact that it's work performed in order to have impact on a self. Organization work, we had a session on that. Some examples being of that, those literatures that touch on this being strategy work, boundary work, technology work. Organization work, there the social symbolic object is the organization. And then Tom just took us through very expertly, of course, since he invented it, the institutional work, the idea of institutional work. And now what we want to do is talk a little bit about how we use these and how we use them together. So it came up on several occasions, and that's what we want to talk about. So what are we going to talk about in this session? Well, from now until we finish up, we'll talk about these two questions. What opportunities arise, when we examine how different forms of work are combined together, and what opportunities emerge from the connections between social symbolic objects. So the ways in which work is used to connect together, to split up, to shape these sorts of connections. So that's what we're going to talk about. And really this is about thinking how we use those different kinds of work that we've defined. How do we use them to structure interesting studies and to structure interesting ways to explore the world. Yeah, and this also, I think, reflects much more what happens in the real world. It's actually not that common to see really pure kinds of work. A lot of times there's different sorts of work are being conducted at the same time, all for the same purpose, or there's different actors performing different kinds of work in different ways to impact the same object, or etc. It's much more complicated than the way we've been discussing it in much of reality. And I think that figuring out and thinking through the opportunities that gives us is worthwhile. You remember this picture? We talked about it the last session, and I think that was a great example. As soon as we started talking about this picture, we were sort of thinking about, okay, what's going on here? Well, it's self-work because it's Elon Musk, developing his sense of self, the company working with him, doing lots of work around Elon Musk's self, but it's also organizational work. It's about the organization work. It's also about his rocket company, because this was, of course, blasted into space by the rocket company. So it's about Tesla. It's about whatever his space company is called, can't remember. And so there's lots of organizational work. There's lots of individual work, or self-work, sorry. And it's a really, this was a great example. We already talked through a bit about this, about just all the things that are all the different kinds of work and all the different actors that are happening in this situation. And that's actually much more realistic. So if we think back to our little picture, then we get, when we start putting these things together, we can't get into a really not different and really interesting possibility of kind of thinking through what's happening using this different kinds of social symbolic work that are happening by different actors, right? And then why are these different actors doing what they're doing? Because what kind of effects is it having, both purposeful, what kind of effects are not ones that any of the actors wanted that are coming out of this combination? How are the effects that are being produced by different forms of work interacting? What kind of practices and resources? All the kind of stuff we talked about with separate forms of social symbolic work. Putting them together gives us a whole bunch of new questions to ask. So that's what we want to focus on. That's what we want to think about, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you in thinking a little bit about how you can use these concepts in your research in a more sophisticated way than just one kind of work being done by one actor to impact one social symbolic object. Yeah? Okay. Very good. Tom, did you want to add anything in terms of just the setup, and in terms of why? I know when we were talking at the break, you had mentioned a couple of things. I tried to remember and say them. Was there anything you wanted to add in terms of where I'd gotten to about it yet, and before I show
only that one of the directions we're trying to travel in is this integrative way, one where we look at different combinations of social symbolic work, But what we're not suggesting is that you can look at everything. Um, and so there are practical and conceptual limits to the complexity you can include. But one of the things that we've found reading across the literatures is that um, there's often been a trade-off where simplicity has kind of dominated at the expense of bringing in some of the complexity that you find in your empirical work. So one of the things we're trying to do in the rest of the day is really give you some strategies for shifting that balance somewhat.
So in the book, we talk about the three different possibilities in terms of combining this. Of course, the fourth one is if you combine all three kinds of work together, that would give you another category. And I thought I just talked about this particular one as an example. You can read the others if you have already. Great. If you are interested, we do give several examples of self work and institutional work and self work and organizational work and institutional work there in the chapter. But I just thought I'd talk a little bit about this because this is one where actually it was quite helpful for us in the paper. This is a paper that is based on Elena Delpiat, my colleague at Imperial. It's her thesis research, and then Paul Tracy from Cambridge, who you met last session, and I worked with her to put this paper together. And this paper is about a really interesting company, which if you read the chapter or read the paper before, you'll already know. It's about Alessi, which is an Italian company that was founded in the 1920s, and initially founded to create metal, mainly metal, so cutlery and knives and things like that for the home, and then got largely into providing that kind of thing to the restaurant trade and to hotels. So they were making very serviceable, not bad looking kinds of metalware, and also some plates and things like that that were really useful and decent, but they weren't design items. If you look at what they are now, they are a design-led company. They have many products in museums all over the world. And there was a really interesting place where they changed from being this sort of supplier to the hospitality trade to becoming this design company. And that's a kettle, which some of you may have seen or have on your stove. And that's the guy I'm going to talk about, Alberto Alessi. And that's a very famous item that they produced, which is actually if you want to guess, if you don't know, that's for juicing lemons or oranges, right? But it's really, really beautiful to have on your shelf. And what happened and what we studied was a combination of organizational work and self-work. What this gentleman whose picture is there did is actually used, and we did a narrative analysis looking at two kinds of work, which was work around him as a person and why he was a legitimate successor to take over in the company, combined with work done by him and his team around changing what the company's identity was. So organization work around changing the company from this sort of supplier to the hospitality trade of functional items to this company that builds art, that creates art for the home, where the things that they make are so amazing that they're in design museums. And this was a great example of where, in quite a traditional area, which is entrepreneurship, we were able to use these two different kinds of narrative work at an individual level, and narrative work in terms of the organizational level. So the self-work, organization work, and putting those together and looking at how they were done and how the impact each had, and then the combined impact, and how that led to the success of this company becoming incredibly successful, both in terms of fulfilling the vision of Alberto Alessi, but also financially successful. So very interesting company. So this was an example of combining together, and that's what we mean by how you can use these to look at more complicated problems than just looking at one kind of work at one level.
Awesome. Before you go on,
Yes.
In relationship to this paper, so Dolores asked the question, how do you select what to focus on in a specific setting where different types of social symbolic work could be observed? Is it worth putting a particular one at the center? And so just wondered in this case, today you're talking about in terms of organization work and self-work. I don't know the history. I really don't know the history of this paper at all. And so I wondered, can you talk a little bit about that set of choices?
Yeah, so this paper was about succession. So this Elena, this comes from the original kind of research, as I mentioned, came from her thesis. She'd done quite a lot of work looking at actually looking at narratives, and then what Paul and I helped her reframe it as is the object. So she had already done some stuff and was very interested in narratives because narrative was so obviously important in this company. The stories they told and the stories they retold and the way they told the story of how the company had completely changed because of Alberto coming in and moving it from being almost like an industrial company to an art company. Like that's an incredible change. And she'd studied that. And what we kind of worked with her in this case, we became interested in is how he managed the succession. So this is an Italian family firm. They're all related. They're uncles and aunts and sons and sisters and cousins. And so, and this is he was the fourth generation to take over, but there was other cousins. So what became interesting is the other cousins with different perspectives. So the question became, why did this guy succeed and why was he able to do this? And then that led us to think about this narratives that he produced as a kind of work, reconstructing the identity of the organization while simultaneously explaining and making his vision and him as a leader. The one is tricky in family firms because you can't say, usually in a normal firm, you say, I'm the new leader and I'm good because I'm not the old leader who was crap. You can't do it when it's your uncle. You have to figure out a narrative that says, my uncle's amazing, but I'm an amazing successor and I'm going to take the firm in a different direction. Not that he was wrong, but this is builds on. So it's a really complicated narrative work. So that's where we got. It took a long time. We didn't just sit down and come up with that. It took a long time to work through, but it was really about thinking what had they achieved and then what was the objects that they'd worked on and what kind of work was it. And thinking through that, we could see, oh, narrative. There's many other things we could have looked at, but that came out as for us as a really important thing. And of course, succession in family business is a really core topic in entrepreneurship. Does that make sense, Tom? Does that answer
Yeah,
the
no,
question?
that's really helpful. And I think, if you think about it and in general terms, then like so much of what we do, especially if you do qualitative work, you start with a set of sensitizing kinds of concepts, but then you work around and around and around to work out what should be at the center. And I think one of the things that the Alessi story shows is the kind of potential leverage you can get from not having simply organization work, for instance, at the center, but by having a constellation of different kinds of objects and forms of work at the center that it revolves around. And that the art of it, I suppose, is how much complexity to include and how much to strip away.
And
That's great.
the most important thing is you're not studying social symbolic work. You're using a social symbolic work perspective to study something. This is a paper using work, but it's not a work. It's not no. There's not work in the title. This is about how succession was constructed and a company was reconstructed using narrative work. But that's the frame. So what we're contributing to is succession, the literature on succession. If you try to write a paper that contributes by discovering social symbolic work, they'll say Tom and Nelson already did that, right? So you need to use these concepts to research something else, right? Right? If that makes sense? These are framework, like institutional work. It's too late to discover institutional work. You can use an institutional work framework to study lots of interesting things. And the same thing with this whole framework. You can use several different forms of work and mix them together, which is what we did here, using two levels, makes it much more interesting and powerful and makes much more of a contribution. But the object, really, the objects were the organization identity and the individual identity, but it was really about succession. That's the theoretical hook. Yeah. Okay, I'll carry on because we're going to run out of time. And in the in the book, we talk about just some different forms, and I'm not going to go through them in any detail. Um, um, uh, just that there's different ways that you can put together different forms of work. One can follow another, so you can do one and then you can do a second. So you can see an actor start out doing self work and then changing to institutional work. For example, somebody who starts out working on their self as a gay man and then becomes really inspired to join social movements and get involved and try to change the institutions around gay rights, for example, right? Aligning forms of work is what we saw in the Alessi case, where there's two kinds of work and they're happening together, but they're not mixed together. There's one set of things going on one side and one on another. There's two different things happening at the same time. And the last one is when the same activities are really having working as multiple forms of work. And to some degree, that was true of Alessi, but to some degree, you can see separate narrative work going on around Alberto Alessi and around the company. But you can see sometimes there's the same activity is actually having two kinds of impacts on two different social symbolic objects. Anything to add there, Tom? I think it's just.
Yeah, just before you move on, I was thinking about what you were saying with respect to whether one asks questions using social symbolic work to understand something else, or whether you might ask questions about social symbolic work. I think one of the things where the framework does provide an opportunity to ask questions within it is in terms of things like these different strategies for combining forms of work. It was interesting, like if I think about the history of institutional work as an area, then it kind of went through three phases, and only one was interesting, and it's kind of past that. But it started out with the boring phase of people wrote papers that were lists of institutional work, and they got published because there hadn't been lists before, and then there were lists. And then the interesting thing that happened was people started to ask questions that couldn't really have been asked without the concept of institutional work about it. So how did different forms of institutional work interact? How did they combine? What was the relationship between maintaining institutions and transforming institutions? What kind of actors were involved? Blah, blah, blah. And then now it's gotten to the point where it's actually the most interesting forms of institutional work research are used to study something else. With social symbolic work, I think lists of social symbolic work are never going to be that interesting, but the interactions between them are something that I think the perspective offers within itself that maybe the individual forms of work don't really. And so you can imagine research questions simply about sequencing and how does sequencing work? When does it work? What does sequencing look like in different contexts? When does it work to align forms? When does it not work to align? Or what resources, so if you look at the Alessi case, what resources are needed or strategies needed to connect or align different forms of social symbolic work? And then similarly, we use an example in the book of Pussy Hat with the March on Washington example, where there was all kinds of aims emanating from single instances of institutional work, or single instances of social symbolic work. And again, you could start to ask questions within the perspective that you probably couldn't ask outside of it. So just before you forced to run off and apply it somewhere else, you probably can work from within it a bit.
Okay, so we're going to give you a chance. We've talked a lot, and we want you to have a chance to have it. Since we can't chat with you all individually, we want to put you in groups as usual and just give you a chance to talk a little bit about this, to give you something to talk around. And you know, always good to have a picture of a polar bear. That's just generally true of all presentations. And what we're going to talk about, though, is not polar bears, but what's happening to polar bears. So climate change just as a context. So when you think about climate change and you think about what's kind of happening with actors who are seeking to reduce carbon emissions, what can you think of in terms of examples of actors who are using multiple forms? Have you seen where they're combining multiple forms? What are they? How is it working? Can you unpack a little bit of what you're seeing using this kind of perspective, right? What are the costs and benefits of combining forms of social symbolic work? Think a little bit about that. When you put, does it require more resources? What's the downside of this, if there is any? And what's the upside, right? And part of the upside is definitely more impact, but is there anything else? Okay, so that's what we'll get you to do. And if you have any questions about combining social symbolic work, when you come back, just put them in the chat. You don't have to do anything on the Jamboard this time. Just have a chat, and then we'll come back and carry on with the good discussion. Is that clear? Everyone okay with that? Yeah, excellent. Okay, very good. So Rohini, if you can put them into their breakouts, we'll give them 15 minutes in groups of 3 to discuss this. Maybe not now because we don't have that.
Maybe not now.
Oh, it's a pity. You know, I was just getting ready here. I had the water. It's great.
All right, so we're not gonna. We didn't ask you to write anything I hope that went well. I hope that was interesting. I just to have a chat about how you combine forms of work. To the degree to which you talked about climate change as an example is up to you. We were obviously talking to Sid about his research because it's a good example of where there's multiple forms of social symbolic work going on in multiple objects. So we were using his work to have a bit of a discussion because he ended up in a room by himself. If you're wondering why he was chatting with us. Um, but if you do have any questions about this, I'm gonna carry on a bit. But Tom is going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have any particular questions about this that came up from your in your discussions, you definitely pop them up on the chat. Tom will do the usual magic and either answer you or interrupt me. And you know, that's really, I guess, what we'd be interested in is any questions you have about, not so much about climate change or about even your work right now, but really about combining forms of social symbolic work in using that to do research, right? So that's kind of, any questions about that, really happy to see those. Okay, let's carry on a little bit. And for me, actually, in some ways, this next stuff is actually quite interesting because it kind of connects us even more directly back to ideas from social construction, and it's about, you know, the connection between social symbolic objects, the question that bringing new social symbolic objects into being, how does social symbolic work connect with that, and we have in the book we suggest a set of possible ones just to get you thinking. It's not an exhaustive list. It's just some areas where we see that social symbolic work is really impacting either the connections between social symbolic objects or the social symbolic objects themselves. I'm going to go through those. I'm going to talk through them relatively quickly. Yeah, as usual, ask questions in the chat if you like. The first one, which we talk about in the book, is enactment, and enactment is when someone takes something that's happening, an actor takes something that's happening, a set of things, and something that's happening in the world, some patterns that are happening in the world, and makes that. Oh, sorry, got the wrong way around. Sorry, enactment is when someone takes a social symbolic object and uses it, draws on it in order to use it in some context. So you might think about an institution being drawn on in an organization, or the example here, surgeons drawing on institutionalized understandings of surgeons to be surgeons themselves and construct their own selves, right? You can think about this, maybe the self level is the easiest, how many people draw on all kinds of different institutions, whether it's an institution of the church and what a priest should be like, whether it's an institution of the university and what a professor should be like, or an academic should be like, all of these things where people construct selves drawing on these themselves, but also the institutions maybe drawing these, the organizations drawing these institutions in order to pressure people, actors, individuals in this case, usually to act in a particular way, to dress in a particular way, to do whatever, because they're not acting like a proper X, whatever X is. But of course, this also happens, in organizations where something that becomes an institution then is drawn on in order to create or manage or change or shape some part of the organization. Sometimes it's done by multiple actors, and those actors can be individuals, organizations, or networks, right? But really, it's about taking an institution and making it happen in local environment. The idea of a CFO and having a CFO or chief risk officer, or one of the many kinds of new organization positions that have come into being and become institutionalized, and then individual organizations decide they need one of those and they create one inside the organization. They're doing organization work, but they're drawing on this institution and making one inside of their organization. Okay. So that's one, and that's kind of really anyone who's interested in institutional work, that should be quite a familiar idea, that institutions, people draw on them and actually create their local instantiations of those. So you guys talking a lot about practices. There's an institutionalized practice at the level of the field, and in particular organizations, they have their own version drawing on that and enacting it in the local context. Abstraction, this is the one I started talking about. Sorry, I got confused for a second. Abstraction is about when some aspect of lived experience, of action, of activity is a pattern detected or a pattern constructed on that activity and named, and it becomes a thing. It's tested out, it's iterative, it happens in a group, right? And basically what we do is we create a new thing, a new idea of something from what we see happening. So things like, and then two examples of one at a self level, sustainability officer, and maybe one at an organizational level, blockchain company, right? And these are things that have come into being, which would be nonsensical in 1970. Neither of these terms would mean anything. These are kinds of things that we've produced, concepts, ideas of new sorts of things, categories that you guys were talking before about, and that are constructed by people, not people, by actors. Some of them are individuals, some of them organizations, some might be networks, sometimes often a number of them together interacting, naming something, and then it becoming accepted and becoming something, a new thing, right? And this is a really interesting, this is the process of social construction, right? It's the construction of an object out of patterns that are perceived, and that are named, and that then become accepted in the group. Anything, Tom, you want to add? Anything coming up in the chat?
Just one thing to note that maybe we'll come back to it as well. Just the idea that when we talk about these different ways in which different social symbolic objects are connected, whether through enactment or abstraction and what others, it links back to what you were talking about before the break in terms of those different forms of social symbolic work, and especially sequencing, where you see forms of work creating kind of intermediate objects that then act as resources for further kinds of work. And so you can imagine abstraction and the construction of something like a sustainability officer label then being used as a resource for obviously for enactment. And then that allows, if you think about what diffusion looks like, it can often look like the combination of abstraction and enactment. Diffusion has a kind of epidemiological or non-agential kind of image to it. But if you think about it as forms of abstraction where we take lived experience, create an object, then that object becomes portable that other people can start to enact, turn into a kind of a local instance of that object. And so anyway, so just to think about, as we're talking about these things for everyone, to think about what they would look like in terms of chains and sequences of social symbolic work, but also parallel and aligned forms of social symbolic work.
And Alicia asked a question, do we carry out abstraction as researchers, or is the abstraction carried out by the actors themselves? John Van Manen talks about the fact that we tell stories about the stories that people tell about the things that they actually do. So there's multiple levels of abstraction. Our theories are abstractions that are abstractions about the stories that we're told by the people we interview and hang around with to explain what's happening to us. And that's their abstraction of some physical world that they're interacting with other people. So it's, by the time you get to an ASQ paper, that's abstractions of abstractions of abstractions, right?
But our focus in the book is especially on what actors are doing. Yep. And so we don't mean it's just what we do. We use that as a metaphor. We use that to help understand. We use social construction as a epistemological, metaphor for what actors are doing in the field.
Translation, many of you will be experts on this as a sociological literature and as a institutional literature. There's both a large sociology literature on translation, these Latour and Cologne and all these people, and also Scandinavian institutionalism, which is very concerned with this idea. And this is basically about moving, in our case, social symbolic objects from one context to another, and that in that process there has to be some way to deal with all the parts that don't fit in the new context, right? So we have to make things fit and be sensible. So a paper that I did with Paul, who you met last week, is on how the Italians near Venice in Veneto, how they brought the idea of an incubator from California to Italy and what they had to do to make it fit, how they had to edit it, right? And that was one way of thinking and looking at that as cultural entrepreneurship, which is kind of what we were influenced by, and we framed it as a account of creating a new organizational form. But there's many different ways that this idea can be used. But what you see is some social symbolic work that's moving somehow an object that exists in one context to another object. And how is that work? What forms of work are going on? What actors are doing it? What are they actually doing to make that object, to translate it into a new context? Is that okay, Tom? You look like you want to say something. No, you're good? Okay. Oops. Inversion is an interesting one. It's I mean, I think in some ways it's something we all see around happening. People taking social symbolic objects and inverting the kind of valence of those things, making things that were meant as an insult into something that suddenly becomes a label that people are proud of, something that was good, bad, something that was bad, good. An example we use in the book is the label queer in the LGBT community, and there's a little quote here, which is also in the paper in the book, just saying, you know, we were called queer, so we decided to make it into a word that meant something to us. We are queer, but we're not queer. It doesn't mean what you say. It means something to us. It's us, and it's about us. They took this word that was used in a derogatory sense and made it into part of their identity, something they were proud of, right? And this is a great example of inversion, right? Of taking this, but it can be either direction. This is taking something negative and making it positive, using social symbolic work of various kinds to make it positive. Also the other way is completely true. You can take something that's positive and make it into something that has a negative.
I have a question or comment here. Like at what point, you know, do you feel that's actually accepted? I mean, like, you know, from psychology, looking at introversion and extroversion, but there's ambiversion. I would argue there's just as many people in the LGBT community that don't accept queer in that kind of context and still feel it's derogatory. So like, what evidence do we have, or like at what point, I guess, is there a critical mass that we're looking at a quantitative to try to prove that, or?
Well, it's what Tom said before, right? It's an empirical question. So all social symbolic objects are attached to certain social groups, right? And so you can certainly have within the LGBT community groups of people for whom this is a label that they use and appreciate, or whatever, that's not that they see as part of their identity, and another part of that community, because you know that there's sub communities within all groups of all groups of people, or groups of organizations, or groups of whatever. So it's just an empirical question, the degree to which and how many people. These are all, as soon as we get into these sorts of meaning questions, it's always a matter of degree and to whom, right? So I can't, there's not a standardized way to measure this. What you do, I mean, if we wanted to study this, the gentleman who wrote this quote for that person and some other number of people, which we would have to go explore. This inversion has happened. There could be many people for whom it hasn't happened, and within the LGBT community, that's an empirical question, right?
Just to add just one thing there, that I mean, part of your question, Morgan, may come from maybe that we've used the word, almost the forms of the words slightly imprecisely, but also our examples. All our examples are of successful versions of this. But what we're really actually pointing at is that the relationships between objects depends on work. And so if you turn these more into gerunds, sort of inverting, abstracting, enacting, and so on, then the focus becomes more on the work that's done to attempt to create an object or translate it or invert it and so on. And so while it's entirely reasonable to ask how and whether and why something is successful as a case of inversion, it's also really just interesting to think about people's efforts to invert. Because your point is right, that usually these things are mixed in terms of their success. And that's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily make them less interesting for us.
And Daniel put an interesting one there, deplorables for Trump supporters is another example where I'm sure there are many Trump supporters who don't find that a good label. Exact. I mean, and we are not in any way. These are all empirical questions. Who does? Who doesn't? To what degree? What actors? These are our theory. This idea of inversion is not making any assumptions about any of that. That's all empirical. Those are all great empirical questions. How that works, how does the social symbolic work fit into that? How does it fit into existing social symbolic objects? So the existing other kinds of, in terms of Trump supporters, the other kinds of categories and labels that exist. How does this new label deplorables? How did it fit? How did it end up the way it was? That's an interesting empirical research question.
But then I have a question on this. Is it not then also the inversions that they reflect on assumptions that people have, on references that people use? So and on evaluations that people have. So in a way also on convictions and maybe also beliefs they have. So we have this example of a geek, nerd, or if you have queer. And then we can perceive it really positively. And if I'm labeled this way, I think, oh wow, that's a compliment. Where the same person can say, oh no, this is like an insult. So therefore, for me, it all reflects on how experiences, on assumptions, on also reference points and experiences that people had with this categories they encounter and how they make sense. So people can make sense of the same category in a totally different way and therefore end up with different meanings. But both could do social symbolic work on the same category.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, it's interesting because you brought up one of the examples in the chat around geek and nerd. And one of the things I think that you're pointing to is that when you look at all these different forms of work connecting objects, we're not really specifying what kind of objects we're talking about. So each of these could be a form of self-work, each of these could be a form of organization work or a form of institutional work. And so you could imagine taking a label and inverting it in a very personal way for yourself as a part of your identity or part of your career and so on. You could also imagine it being done at a much more conceptual or social level as an institution. And so one thing to keep in mind is that these are forms of work, but also that they're kind of agnostic in terms of the kinds of objects that we're talking about.
And I also have a question on this, because if I'm putting this inversion thing on only for myself, but then let's assume we have like social media, right? And then this thing just, I did not intend to do something, but it just gets attention and it kind of develops in a bigger, I don't know, community group thing. So then maybe it also over time develops into institutional work. Is this then, like if I do not participate in this as the one who brought it up, am I then out of the analysis, so to speak? Or am I still in? So
I think you're in the analysis depending on what the question is. But if you go back to the kind of idea of sequences of institutional work and chains of institutional work, there's no reason that in complex chains of social symbolic work that the actors are going to remain constant in any way. So if you think about in complex organizations, there's often chains of social symbolic work done where an actor creates an object of some kind and passes it on to someone else to use, kind of like a supply chain. And we create ideas, concepts, or we create physical objects that someone else then uses. Someone might connect it to something else. Someone might enact a concept. Someone then might invert a concept. And all those different actors are relevant or not. Kind of going back to what Nelson said much earlier, it really just depends on what the more general social phenomenon or problem is that you're trying to understand, that you're trying to use social symbolic work as a theory or a perspective to understand. That's what really sets the boundaries, rather than there being kind of more inherent boundaries.